Hey everybody, thank you for listening to the Catholic Brothers podcast. I am Stephen.
And I'm Daniel.
And today we start off our third season of the Catholic Brothers, and this is our first episode. I really can't think of a better way to do that than to have two really awesome guests for you guys. We're going to be talking about sacred music today, going through a little bit of the history of it, what it is, and sort of what's going on with it today. And obviously we know that in recent decades it has been in a rough spot, and so we're really focusing on how to preserve and to restore sacred music in the Catholic Church. So before we get into the content, just want to say and remind you, if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment on the video, like the video, and make sure you tap the bell for notifications when an episode drops. So we have Jonathan Rokosz, and we have Nicholas Will. Dan, why don't you introduce John to our audience?
Yeah, so many of our subscribers already know John from our reviews of certain movies, but John, welcome back. John Rokosz is a graduate of Duquesne University and is the director of music for Most Precious Blood of Jesus Parish in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, an apostolate of the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest. His parish will be hosting Bishop Athanasius Snyder during this year's Catholic Identity Conference. His Schola of 12 Voices has been featured on WAOB-FM Catholic Radio, on EWTN, and they have produced 2 professional albums available on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and all major streaming apps. You can learn more about his parish at mpboj.com or see more of his composition and performance credits at johnrokosz.com. Welcome, John.
Thanks, guys. Good to be back.
Absolutely. So we have our second guest is Nicholas Will. He is the director of liturgical music and an organist and lecturer at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. He held a similar position at the Pontifical North American College in Rome and was also an assistant professor of music and coordinator of the sacred music program at Franciscan University, Steubenville. He is a graduate of Duquesne University. He's a past winner of many awards. He's performed as an organist, accompanist, and conductor throughout the eastern United States and in Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Croatia. His recordings as an organist and conductor have been released by Navona Records and Jade Music, and he is a published composer with Cantica Nova Publications. Nicholas is also the founder and president of the St Gregory Institute of Sacred Music, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to training present and future generations of church musicians. So if you want to learn more about that work at the St. Gregory Institute, just visit Saint, S-A-I-N-T, gregoryinstitute.org. Nicholas, it is a huge pleasure to have you on today. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you both for obviously for the work you're doing. I tell you, at the parish level, it's so hard to find organists, even in this big diocese of Chicago.
Yeah.
We always talk about how hard it is to get an organist, how hard it is to get a choir, and so we'll touch on a little bit of that today. But I appreciate both of you and the work you're doing in the church.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
So why don't we just start by kind of setting the stage and kind of defining our terms, right? Because there's going to be a lot of people who are listening who may not be familiar with this specific term, sacred music. You know, we might say sacred music, and some people might think that's a general term. But in church thought, that's actually a very defined word, right? So, Nick, why don't you give us an introduction, kind of generally, to what is sacred music? What do we mean by that? Sure.
Yeah. Sacred music has to do more than just mention God. You know, in the church's eyes, usually, especially in the 20th century, when she talks about sacred music, she means liturgical music, music that is written and set aside for divine worship, the Mass or the Divine Office, Liturgy of the Hours. But of course, there's lots of music of a religious nature that falls outside that category. And usually that is known as devotional music, or sometimes the church uses the term religious music, right? So there are a couple ways to think about this. I often say, if sacred music is the Roman Missal, the book that the priest uses to say Mass, religious music might be the family Bible, right? Or you could think of, the priest's sacred vestments. He doesn't wear those outside the liturgy. It would be odd, but also it would be sacrilegious, because those are set aside for a specific purpose. And so sacred music likewise is set aside for a specific function, divine worship.
And so religious music then, are we saying you wouldn't consider it, or we wouldn't consider it liturgical?
Right. Well, and that's usually how the church defines it too. They're not always completely consistent, but generally, when they say sacred, they mean liturgical music.
And especially
Okay,
too,
and-
when
and-
you talk about liturgical music, it's I think we were saying that there are certain qualities that the church would like to see with that. A lot of it is based in actual scripture. With some of the polyphony, they say that it's most desirable to be based on the actual chants, the Gregorian chant. So there are some certain qualities that make it especially appropriate for a liturgical function.
Right, and
I'm
I
glad
mean,
you
and
say
that's
that.
because the
Yeah,
church
I'm glad you say
views
that.
sacred music. Oh, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go ahead, Jen. Go ahead, Nick.
The church has criteria because it is so important. At Vatican II, the church said that sacred music, the treasury of sacred music, is more valuable than any other art, than architecture, than sculpture, than painting. And the reason for that is because music is part of the liturgy. It's not separate. It's not extra in any way. And so because it's so important to who we are as Catholics and what we believe and what we do, the church has laid out certain criteria, like John was saying.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, on the importance of music, I guess in general would be, I mean, that often there's been scholars of the early church who have said that this Jesus movement was a singing movement, praising God, and you see some of the hymnography hymns that are in the New Testament and whatnot that make up Holy Scripture itself, and so this kind of singing music and movement has been there since the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so generally, when we're talking about the origins of sacred music, I mean, broadly speaking, where does it come from, right? What are its origins in church history?
It's a little bit hard to say definitively a lot about music in the church in the early centuries, what it sounded like, things like that. We have references to it in the New Testament, in Paul's epistles, as you mentioned. But in terms of notating music, we didn't have a system of notating sacred music, or really any music in the West until right around the 9th century, around the time of Charlemagne. And so it was a completely oral tradition for all that time. So we don't know what it sounded like. I think it's safe to assume that early Christians borrowed some things from Jewish practice, certain modes or melodic motifs. We certainly know that they used the Psalms, that they prayed the Psalms, and they probably sang them, in a similar fashion to Jews of the time. And we also know early on that they were writing hymns specifically about Christ, Christian hymns, usually in Greek. And we have a lot of examples of that. The Gloria from the Mass, for instance, was originally a Greek hymn. And we know that St. Ambrose and other church fathers were writing hymns to combat heresy, because the heretics had really great songs, apparently, to spread heresy. And so St.
always
Ambrose
do,
and
don't they?
others...
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Saint Ephraim the Syrian, too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And St. Hilary, a number of them. So we know that was an important part of the church fairly early on.
So explain. So there's a distinction, though, isn't there? There's something that's called Old Roman chant and then Gregorian chant, right? What's the difference between the two? And when does Gregorian chant, I think more people are familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
When does Gregorian chant become a thing in the church?
Well, you guys have really prepped for this. This is great. Usually don't get asked a lot of questions about old Roman chant.
You're on the Catholic Brothers, buddy.
I know. It's a great story. I bore all of my seminarians with it every year.
Well, bore us.
Yeah, so yeah, you have to remember that, especially prior to the Council of Trent, and going back even another 700 years before that, there were various rites in the West. We see that today in the East, right? The various Eastern rites that have sometimes different language, different liturgy, different musical tradition. For many centuries in the West, it was the same way. So you had Peninsula, you had the Ambrosian rite in the north, you had the Roman rite around Rome, you had the Beneventan rite south of that, you had one in France, you had one in England, and there was a lot more variety. There were some things, obviously, that were the same. So what happens, essentially, is the Roman rite, and I got to be careful, I'm not a liturgical scholar, so I don't want to get any dates too wrong here and have people...
You can pretend.
Yeah. So the Roman rite, as we knew it up until pretty much 1960, until 1970, really, pretty much takes its shape around the time of St. Gregory the Great, so 6th century into the early 7th century. St. Gregory had a choir in Rome called the Schola Cantorum, the School of Singing. That's where we get that term that we use to call a lot of Catholic choirs today. That was sort of the Pope's choir. And they sang but also composed new chants, developed chant. And that's sort of where we get that idea that St. Gregory invented chant, but he didn't. The Holy Spirit didn't descend in the form of a dove and whisper melodies in his ear. We probably not, maybe. I don't know. Probably.
Oh,
I know. Sorry to ruin it. But so,
why'd we ask him?
You have this Roman Schola Cantorum doing their thing. So a couple centuries later, and they had to teach the Frankish singers how to sing this chant because it was an oral tradition at that time. It was not written down. But because of all this, they were starting to write it down. This sort of necessitated a notation system if you have to teach everyone in the Frankish kingdom how to do this. And so what happened was that essentially what scholars think is the melodies, the old Roman chant melodies, were taken by the Franks and they were sort of decorated in a particular way using melodic turns of phrase that the Frankish singers liked. And I like to think of it as sort of like, you think of Frankish or Gothic architecture, right? Lots of filigree and decorating and that sort of thing. I imagine it's sort of the same thing with the music. Most scholars do agree that the old Roman chant was probably a little bit simpler. And so this became kind of a new type of chant, Franco-Roman chant. Also, it came to be known as Gregorian chant, but it was really kind of formed right around 9th, 10th century.
okay.
Nice. So I'm wondering, like, when we say, okay, this is what sacred music is, I think it's always good to give like some tangible examples of that people can grab onto and understand, like, what is kind of like not sacred music. Like what like today that we see in Roman Catholic parishes would be considered like devotional or religious, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think not to get too deep into documents and things like that, but they're helpful, right? So St. Pius X said that sacred music had to have three qualities, or it wasn't fit. What really wouldn't be sacred music. He said for music to be truly sacred, it needed to be holy, and which meant that it couldn't have anything secular in it, right? In terms of connotation, or something that would remind us of the world too much. It had to be true art, it had to have goodness of form, he said. So there's like it's not the idea that beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Like there are, objective truths here that some pieces of music written are lesser, and it had to be universal to a certain degree. And furthermore, he said that if it had the first two qualities, if it was holy and if it had goodness of form, that it would be universal to some extent. And so I think what we're talking about with some examples of music, and not just written in the last 60 years, by the way, there's been a lot of bad in worldly sacred music written for quite a long time, but there's a lot of it now. I think the intent is to write sacred music, but I think a lot of what we hear in churches nowadays doesn't really pass the test in terms of being appropriate sacred music.
So you mentioned some good guidelines there for us. So at Vatican II, so let me read what Vatican II has outlined for music and liturgy. It says it should be on the condition that the instruments are suitable or can be made suitable for sacred use, and that the music accords with the dignity of the temple, and truly contributes to the edification of the faithful. So that to me sounds a little different than what the guidelines you had pointed out from the Pope.
Sure.
Right? Or am I reading that wrong?
No, I think if you kind of look at, there was certainly a lot of development in the 20th century, right? So the document that you're reading from is Sacrosanctum Concilium, correct? Yeah. So that's
yep.
63. St. Pius X, the other, the one I was mentioning is 1903. So yeah, Pius X is kind of a hardliner in some ways, right? He said just in looking at instruments, he said no instruments can be used other than the organ unless you have the express permission of the bishop.
He also said that women can't be in the choir.
Yes, yes. And completely non-controversial, even in 1903. And so we see that. Let's just take that as an example, right? The use of instruments, right? Because we see that develop pretty clearly. So Pius XII in the 50s, he loosens those restrictions a little bit, and he actually even points out that stringed instruments, bowed stringed instruments like the violin and cello and things like that, are especially suited to sacred music. And then,
real quick, Nick. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's really good that you do bring up Pius X, because let's also keep in mind the context with which he was speaking. He was talking about, in 1903, what were we seeing a lot more? We were seeing a lot more of those operatic masses. So like Rossini, I think, was a culprit of that, and we were seeing masses and parts of the mass that were being composed actually from profane sources, bar songs, and actually just things that were done more for theatricality than for liturgical propriety. And so
that's a great point.
It's funny that here we are talking about that even today with the hymnody of today, but it was like Nick had said, it was happening even back then at the turn of the century. So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. And some people think, well, these documents are so outdated, when because they use terms like Pius X will use terms like music of the theater, right? And people assume, and really he's talking about operatic theater, right? Because John's right, like it would be common to have a piece of music lifted straight from an opera and just slap a sacred text on it and have it at Mass. And we said, well, that's not the same thing as today. Well, actually, a lot of the music that's written in the last 30 or 40 years, if you look at it in terms of composition and style, is lifted straight from musical theater, completely, 100%. And so, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But yeah, that line about instruments can be made suitable. But what does that mean, right?
Can be made suitable.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
instruments that are suitable. Yeah, instruments that are suitable or can be made suitable. I don't know how you make an instrument suitable, but they either are or they aren't.
You can put like an Advent wreath around the djembe, and it makes it liturgically appropriate.
Well, you know what? Honestly, I do wonder if you're going to read it with like a friendly light, it could be speaking to, let's say this, like someone comes up and says, we should be able to have drums in the Mass, right? But even then, like there would be a difference, well, what kind of a drum, and how are you using that
Right.
drum? I think is kind of maybe what it's pointing to. Like, you're not going to use a rock drum. Well, you would hopefully not be using a rock drum set in a church, right? But if you've ever been to like a symphony and you see like a concert drum of some sort, or a cymbal,
Kettle drum.
yeah, I mean, maybe that's kind of what they were thinking too, because they're maybe looking over at the Anglicans at the time, who were also using these kinds of instruments in their choral pieces. So, in talking about kind of like the pre-Vatican II history, which we've alluded to already, but let's go even further back, like let's say Middle Ages, like High Middle Ages. What would be like? Are there examples of composers or people who are writing devotional music, but not meant for the liturgy, but also not secular music, right? This in between category between secular music and sacred music, this devotional or religious music. Where did that exist like in the High Middle Ages?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of that music that we don't know about because it was never written down. But we do have some examples of in Italy, for instance, in the Middle Ages, they had laude, which just basically means like praise songs. Something like St. Francis' Canticle of the Sun, right? A lot of the Franciscans wrote these Italian, and sometimes they were in. I mean, modern Italian was just beginning to exist then, but they were in the vernacular language. They were religious in nature, and certainly not intended to be sung in the liturgy. So, there are examples that we know of. There are probably a lot more that we don't know about that are lost to history.
I think a reason that could have been lost in history is just because it didn't really have any practical use or any reason to survive the test of time, because a lot of these liturgical pieces were actually just continuously being used for the liturgy. The liturgy, lasting for centuries. There was always a constant need for it. As opposed to these other devotionals, maybe that's some encouragement for us for the future. Like, some of this devotional music we see, there's just no way it can really survive because it is inorganic from the Mass. And that's something I think it's worth talking about in terms of like the development of music. We talk about like the devotional side of things, but more like with the sacred side of things, with the liturgical side of things, it's always really cool to consider that the Mass and the accompanying music for it developed side by side, hand in hand, over the centuries. In terms of even something like the introit or something like that. These things like developed because of like how the liturgy was developing, and it was and music was made to suit that. And so they grew organically together. And so when you have music that is specifically outside of that, it's pretty noticeable. It's I think that's what we're maybe seeing today.
Well, and conversely, when the Mass is changed, but you're keeping the old music, that you can. So I say this because we've had personal experience with this, where we were at a celebration of the Mass where it was a Novus Ordo, but they kept the music was as if it was a Latin Mass.
A polyphony, yeah, it was a polyphony. It was a Mass.
Yeah, they had sacred polyphony, and the musical accompaniment was like for a Latin Mass, right? Mm-hmm. But you realize very quickly that there was nothing for the priest to do while the music was being sung. And so there was just like these long drawn out moments of like nobody doing anything at the altar, and we're waiting for the choir to just kind of finish up. So that actually maybe take us into the Vatican II era. So we talk a little bit about the pre-Vatican II era. So what do we think in general, reading a document like Sacrosanctum Concilium, right? Like, what was the vision here? What was the goal of the council in your opinion, Nick?
I think, well, we have to be careful here, right? Because anytime you have an ecumenical council, you've got a lot of people and a lot of agendas, right? I think it's fair to say that for the majority of bishops who were at the council, what they envisioned in terms of any liturgical reforms were just a continuation of what had been going on for the previous 2 decades during the liturgical movement. So for those who might not be familiar with that term, in general, it was helping people to understand what was going on in the liturgy. Part of that was, teaching people to understand Latin. That's where we saw the proliferation of hand missals with translations. So you've probably heard the phrase, pray the Mass, don't pray at Mass. So to get people away from just praying private devotions like the Rosary and things like that during a Mass, but to actually have them understand the text. And part of that, in some places, was having them sing things, sing the responses, sing the Kyrie, that sort of thing. And there were a lot of great examples of that before the council, right? So I think a lot of people, a lot of bishops said, yeah, this all seems good. There's a lot of scholarship going on. We're rediscovering old chant manuscripts and things like that. This is all great. And the document itself, if you read it in the light of not only 2,000 years of tradition, but even in 20th century tradition, there's nothing too radical in it, right? There's a greater allowance for the use of the vernacular in the liturgy. But I think a lot of people, a lot of priests, bishops, and faithful were surprised with what the next 10 years brought. And I think that there were some people at the council who for whom that was an aim even from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I believe that a lot of people were hearing what they wanted to hear, and I think that they were just looking for. It's possible that there were powers that were looking for any opportunity. I would say in my opinion, reading that document, for me the word that jumps out is accessibility. The accessibility of the Mass, the accessibility of the Eucharist, the accessibility of the music, trying to foster that active participation. And that's the key word, isn't it? It's always been the key word, since the advent of the Novus Ordo, has been this active participation. And I think there's a great deal of ambiguity with what active participation really means. In terms of general understanding, what does that really mean? Does that mean, okay, well, I got to open my book and I've got to sing all the hymns, or does that mean that I'm interiorly, participating in that I'm focusing on the text, I'm praying the text? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure, and I think that active participation and that accessibility means very, very different thing to very, very different people depending on where you are on the spectrum and what agendas you may be bringing to the table.
Yeah. Well, Sacrosanctum Concilium has these 3 kind of categories, and it wants to prioritize Gregorian chant, and then after Gregorian chant it says polyphony, and then it goes to use the term, as you referred to, Nick, religious singing. So according to the council, it seems like there's these 3 categories of music and singing in the Mass. Is that right to see? Is it right to see Gregorian in that order? Gregorian chant, polyphony, and then, I guess religious singing. However, they're defining that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and that's how. If you look at papal documents earlier in the 20th century, they basically said the same thing, right? That the official music of Roman Catholicism is Gregorian chant. Full stop. Other types of sacred music are allowed, in particular polyphony, and sometimes even they'll mention a time period like the Renaissance, right? The 16th century was a great golden age for polyphony, and so sometimes these documents will say this music especially is suited. This is the best example of non-Gregorian chant that we can have in the liturgy. And then they'll say, and other types of sacred music. Now that's where we get into the weeds, right? And I think, I forget the term, the wording that Sacrosanctum Concilium uses, and it's either there or musicam sacram, but you do see a difference in that third category, And I think it's fair to say that at Vatican II and in the documents, there was a greater desire to make provision for non-Western expressions of sacred music. Mission territories and that sort of thing, enculturation, right? That's pretty lacking prior to Vatican II. And I think, getting back to what we were talking about with regard to instruments, that could be at play there too, right? Any instrument is permissible if it's suitable or can be made suitable. I think what they're talking about there perhaps is connotation, right? Different instruments mean different things in different cultures and in different time periods. So I think they're purposefully, I think that's one of the reasons they're so loose with that.
Yeah, it seems like prior to the mid-20th century in general, so not just like throwing everything onto like Vatican II, but just up until the mid-20th century, it just seems that people who studied music and thought about music, or even people who just had a common knowledge of music, seemed to have greater subtlety for genres of music, for uses of instruments, for even just how a song is structured or composed. It seems like there was just this, on the broad scale, kind of like a simplification of how we even think about music in the 20th century. And we have to remember too that when Vatican II is going on, it's happening at the same time that music is driving a cultural bus, especially in the States. You know, you have the outbreak of rock and roll music. You have parents burning Elvis Presley and Beatles records. So music has great power, right? It's almost like discovering nuclear fusion or something. You know, you can do great things with it, like, you know, chemotherapy to, you know, solve cancer, but you can also create a bomb and blow up whole societies. Well, it's the same thing with music. Music has this power, and I think the ancient philosophers knew that too. You know, like Plato and these people who talked about it. They knew that there was a power that was behind music, and when you let music drive a bus of rebellion in society, in culture in general, I think that might also have bled into what happened after the council. That, like, see how we're talking about what maybe the council fathers had in their mind when they're reading something like Sacrosanctum Concilium. You know, they're thinking, okay, mission territories. They're thinking, music, in their lifetime was like the most rebellious thing was like Frank Sinatra or something, you know. But like, in the post 1960s era, literally all hell has broken loose with music driving the bus. And so I think it was easy then for the 1970s and 80s generation to hear these documents in terms of their cultural music in a way. Is that a fair? Is that a fair drawing out of the narrative?
I think so, and also it's important to remember that, you know, this was a document of an ecumenical council where a lot of different people had an opportunity to suggest and make amendments, right? So it's a little bit of composition by committee, and so one of the results of that always is there are some tensions, perhaps, or perhaps even some things that seem like contradictions, right? I was just talking to John about this. So in these documents, it'll say we must preserve the treasury of sacred music. And then it says, well, the congregation is encouraged to sing the proper of the Mass as much as possible. Well, that's not really possible because the propers change every day, and they're very complicated and very hard. So, which one is it? Well, it's because someone, on that day in the council got their amendment in there, probably. You know what I mean? I'm not a scholar there, but I think that's problematic. Yeah. It's not as clear as, when Pius X is writing his document, because that's what Pius X says. There's no committee involved.
But even a step above that, Nick, is they talk about how important polyphony is. Well, a lot of the best polyphony that they name, and of course, like Pius X, specifically calls out Palestrina. For polyphonic masses, for example. Oh, you think that the choir, that the congregation is going to be singing Palestrina mass down there? It's like you're either trying to preserve polyphony.
We've done Palestrina here, and I can assure you we're not singing along with it.
Yeah. But yeah, like I say, like you say, Nick, I agree. There's like tensions there. There's a little bit of inconsistency there. And what I would say, I mean, granted, I know that the book was it Jubilate Deo, I think was it called, that they
Yeah.
was the book that was published out in response to that, like with all like the common chants and that kind of stuff. I still don't think that that the council properly provided for decent education on what the chant really was and how to really do it. And I think that kind of even bleeds into the age-old joke against Catholics, is that Catholics can't sing. Well, and it's funny, okay, so Nick and I were talking about this, is that when you talk about the Protestants, like Lutherans, and they had hymnody, and basically all of their liturgical music was based on melodies that they knew, music that they knew, and it was very natural for them. And so with Catholicism, we see it differently, because here we go back to our point about Gregorian chant and how that developed and everything like that. At the end of the day, Gregorian chant is hard. It's hard. And the entire library of all polyphony and that kind of stuff is actually based on Gregorian chant. And if you're not able to do that, then that if you're not providing actual education for it, you're really up a creek there. And I think that today's mass inorganically, tries to replace that with devotional music because Gregorian chant's too hard.
Right. So it's clear then that, I mean, I don't know how you can objectively look at the current landscape and say there's not a serious crisis on our hands, right? I mean, we have to look at that and say, even what Sacrosanctum Concilium is calling for in many ways, like when it says that Latin will have a pride of place, right? And all these, it's like you can go to an entire Roman Mass and not hear even a smidge of Latin. He's saying Gregorian chant, pride of place. You can go a whole Mass and never hear one iota of Gregorian chant. Mm-hmm. So there's something wrong, right? And I think whether you're a progressive or a hardcore radtrad or something, I mean, you can all pretty much look at it and say something's not quite right here and in sync with the conciliar documents. So it's, I mean, Nick, I want to talk a little bit about, because everybody can acknowledge that crisis, I want to talk a little bit about, are there any signs of hope, you coming from the seminary point of view? Are there any signs of hope for the future that you're seeing? I mean, I see in my own way, young people are attracted to the Latin Mass, for instance. Okay, well, that's a good thing, right? Trying to reroot ourselves in the tradition of what this is all about. But what are you kind of seeing from the seminary point of view?
Yeah, I mean,
Are we going to make it?
Yeah. I will say this. I've been in seminary. This is my 5th year of full-time seminary work. And I feel a lot better about things than before I started. I mean, almost to a man. First of all, they're simply good men, apart from anything, liturgical preferences or musical preferences. I'm inspired by them, right? You have to really be committed to be a seminarian or to be ordained a priest nowadays, right? So they're just, I admire them for that. And I think it's no secret that on the whole, not universally, but on the whole, people under the age of, say 40, tend to at least be more interested in traditional things than, people in their 60s and above. And that's certainly true amongst seminarians and priests. Again, not universally, but for the most part, that's true. I think a lot of the seminarians, and I found this with my students when I was teaching in Steubenville, they kind of felt like they were robbed of their birthright as Catholics, right? All this glorious beauty and truth that was just hidden under so much ugliness for so many years, and so there's a great desire on the part of a lot of them to recover that and to rebuild that, and because they know it's good for the church, right? They know it's good for the people. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement as to the reasons for the collapse of the church in the West, but I mean, I think it's silly to think that the collapse of our liturgical life had nothing to do with it, right? And so I think they realize there's a lot of work to be done, and they're eager to do it. At least here at Mount St. Mary's, they take, if they're here for all 6 years, they take 6 classes with me. And by the time they leave, they can sing all the priests and deacons' parts in the Roman Missal. And a lot of them come to me to do extra stuff. A lot of them want training in singing in Latin. We have, I think, probably about between the 3 choirs here, we probably have about 40 to 45 seminarians singing in choirs weekly in different languages. And,
wow.
So they're getting
great.
some in-depth. Some of them are getting really in-depth training that way. So yeah, I'm very hard.
Because that was missing for a lot of years, wasn't it, in seminary?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about ignoring documents. I mean, because that's essentially what's going on here, right? We're just ignoring the documents, or choosing to judiciously interpreting them. Those documents of Vatican II also said pretty strong things about the importance of liturgical and musical training for seminarians. And now the liturgical aspect was successful to greater or lesser degree in different places. But, I mean, I can't tell you the number of priest faculty members in places where I've worked, or former pastors, who said, I had nothing, no training, absolutely nothing. And which is really tragic, actually. And thanks be to God, I mean, it's not just here. There are a lot of really great musicians at America's seminaries right now. I can't speak for what's going on in the rest of the world, but I think we have gotten our act together to a certain extent in that regard in most places. And so you'll see the fruit of that, God willing, in 10, 20, 30 years.
Right, it's a little delayed, yep.
Yeah. And so you're saying that it's not just where you're at, but also you've seen like sacred music programs kind of blossoming in other seminaries as well?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, a number of really fine programs. Mm-hmm. St. Joseph's in
That's great.
the Archdiocese of New York, and a number of other places.
Wow, that's awesome. Johnny, from your perspective, being a choir director, kind of boots on the ground in the parish, working for the Institute too. I mean, what are you kind of seeing from your perspective? Kind of, is it a similar trend? Have you ever gone to like a regular Novus Ordo parish, maybe for like a special or something, and then all of a sudden people are like, that was beautiful, and I mean, what has been your experience with it?
Yeah, our parish is, overrun with kids. I mean, youthful families. Catechism. Our catechism program has literally doubled from last year. In our parish choirs, our youth, we now have to have 3 youth choirs because we have 45 kids in our youth choirs, and weddings are going through the roof here. So things are really vivacious around here, and I think there's a little bit a part of it that it's kind of cool to be a part of something like the Institute of Christ the King, because you obviously have your local parish community, but there is a bigger order that's happening here, and you get to be a part of that. So the Institute is present across several countries across the world. So there's a cool ecumenical kind of feeling there, and you get like visitors from the German church and from France, and there's a lot of feeling that like this is definitely spreading. So I think these especially these like the fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, these are really great bastions for gathering people in. So I've been really encouraged by that, and I can tell you that we've had several people come to us and saying, hey, we're trying to have a Latin mass. Would you guys be able to drive out to 2 hours away to Erie to come and sing for us? And so we try to help as much as we can.
Have you?
But there's a great demand in that.
Have your choirs sung for Novus Ordo?
Yes, on a couple of occasions, yes. Yeah, if the, yeah.
John passes his Novus Ordo
usually-
masses to me.
Yeah, because I don't remember how to do them. So yeah.
So Johnny, you did mention that. Go ahead.
I was going to say another encouraging thing about just in terms of like the music side of things. You know, we're talking about like success stories that are happening even today. It's encouraging to talk about compositions that are happening for sacred music even today. My parish has commissioned pieces from composers that are alive today. I've had a good relationship with Christoph Delitz, who's from Germany. He's written us polyphonic motets. I'm trying to get him to write a mass for us. Wilco Brouwers is a chant master. Where's he from? He's from the Netherlands, and he actually we commissioned him to write a mass for us and a couple of motets. So this stuff is being composed even today. And it's a really cool relationship when you can have a schola that's able to take on some of this work, and you can get a decent recording, get it back to the composer, and everybody wins. You get new liturgical music, and it's exciting.
Yeah, you had mentioned that or both of you did, that the Gregorian chant can be very difficult, right? But there's a positive to it too, because it can be predictable. In some ways, like at our parish, we no longer have the Tridentine Mass. We have a Latin Novus Ordo and then an English Novus Ordo, and for the most part, we only have 2 people who do the chanting, and it's beautiful.
Yeah,
and it works. You know,
you wouldn't believe how much it fills the space.
Yeah, like for our listeners, like you don't need the 10, 12 people choir to be able to implement this at
Right.
your church,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we use the term sometimes. In Catholicism, noble simplicity. Right? So, as difficult as some of those chants are, you can do them without instruments. You can do them just with one singer, right? So yeah, they are flexible in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have. I mean, our music director here. Sometimes he is alone. He's the organist, and then he stands up and he does the ordinary chants.
Yeah.
And it works.
That's old school, by the way.
Beautiful.
That used to be like every parish in the
from
United States. Or not every parish, but a lot of parishes.
Yeah, we're old school.
Yeah. Well, here in our diocese, it's out of necessity, unfortunately. But we have so the other thing though is that it's not just like Gregorian chant, right? There's also like if you can't, let's say you can't do some of these like really complicated Gregorian pieces in a local parish. I mean, plain chant is still always there for people to use, right? I mean, I would think like so if you're looking at like let's say a local music director at your run-of-the-mill Novus Ordo parish, he's listening to content like this, and he feels cut to the quick, right? And he's thinking, how can I introduce some of this to the mass? What would you offer as advice as kind of like a good place to start, or like what's a good step-by-step process for getting this introduced into a parish, like on the ground?
John, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, my first suggestion would be to approach some of the quote-unquote simpler masses. Maybe start with the Mass Ordinary. So something like like the Missa d'Angelis is one of the most commonly known chant ordinaries. Very singable, very beautiful. And then you could go into maybe Mass 11, which is Orbis Factor. That's another good one. It's a little bit harder, but these are pretty common ones. Or you could even do like the Mass 18, which I think sometimes people have dipped into that one. That one's in the Latin traditional Latin tradition. That's mostly for the ferias of Lent, but so it's very, very, very simple. But it's legitimate. You can do it for you technically can do it for any time. And I've seen a lot. I think the Agnus Dei is a pretty common one that they do from the Mass 18 in some of the Novus Ordos. So even doing something like that, there's the very, very simple chants that you can start with. I would suggest maybe starting with the ordinary. And in the Novus Ordo, there's they have the introit and they have the communion and antiphons. It's like so there's opportunity for that just in the natural rubrics of the Novus Ordo. So it's not like it's not unheard of to introduce something like that. And if you can, even if you do it in simple psalm tones, just to at least get that in people's minds. And the trick with it though, is you just got to make sure that if you're going to do it, you do it well. Because I've heard horror stories from friends that have maybe been a little bit too bullheaded in trying to introduce Gregorian chant, and they're just going to shove it down people's throats, and they do it in a way that it's just not executed very well, and I feel like it can actually turn people off, if it's not done well. So.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, like, in our parish, I think our pastor does it really well, where we will do the introit when we process out to the back of the church to start the Mass. And then once the servers get to the back and the introit has ended, then we start an actual congregational hymn for the procession up.
Yeah.
Right? So he's actually doing both. And then he'll do the same thing at the end of the Mass, too, where at the end of the Mass you'll have another congregational hymn. But of course, using chant throughout.
I think if I could follow up with John, honestly, I think the most important thing is to help people understand there's more to music at Mass than just the 4 hymns that we sing at entrance, offertory, communion, and after Mass. Right? The idea of the propers, the entrance antiphon, the offertory antiphon, communion antiphon. Those are texts of the Mass that are missing from probably 98% of Masses celebrated in the United States. We would never think to omit
Great point.
one of the readings, right? But those are texts too that are supposed to be sung. And the nice thing today, living in 2022, is there are for whatever your pleasure, whatever the style you want, you're available. If you want, you have the original Latin versions in the Graduale Romanum. There are simplified Latin versions. There are complicated English chant versions. There are simple English versions by a number of composers. There are hymn versions, which sort of would have resembled like what early Protestant music might have looked like. There are choral versions. There are even like contemporary like guitar strumming versions. I mean, all sorts of different ways to do it. But I think that's kind of a hurdle for people. And one advantage of doing something like that in English is sometimes it's not so much that chant is a problem. It's just that for some people or some priests or some laity, just the presence of Latin gives them the heebie-jeebies, and so for me, the language is important. I mean, I think as Roman Catholics, as Latin Rite Catholics, we need to have Latin in the liturgy. But I think a much bigger issue is just, what type of music are we singing? Are we singing the propers? You look at like the Anglican ordinariate liturgies; they often don't have any Latin, and they're some of the most beautiful, post-Vatican II masses that we have, and that model, that 4-hymn model, that goes back much earlier than Vatican II, right? So it's something that we're working against, not just in the last 60 years, but long before that, because a lot of masses in the United States, in most places you might have one high mass a weekend, right, where you heard Gregorian chant, and even there, they might have been like simplified versions. Most of your masses would have either been tomb silent or would have been a low mass with hymns. So kind of what we got after Vatican II was a Novus Ordo version of that, and so it's a lot of inertia to work against. But I recommend too, you might not want to do it at all the masses. That's what I tell the priests. I said, just pick one mass, right? You pick your 10 o'clock or your 11 o'clock mass and do it there. And leave the other ones the same. And if people don't like it, they can go to the other masses. And the other thing too, and this ties in with that idea that the typical incarnation of a Roman Rite Mass today in the United States is a low mass with hymns, is the priests never sing anything. So then it reinforces that opinion that we're just singing our favorite songs at Mass, right? Because so that's what I tell the seminarians. I said, I don't care how fancy the music is or how beautiful the music is. You need to be doing your part. You need to be singing your part. And that they really have bought into. I mean, that is so important. And I've found that even if
That's
you're
great.
singing,
Very good.
hymns that are kind of objectionable or less than ideal, say, if the priest is chanting his parts and they're chanting all the dialogues and the congregation's chanting the Lord's Prayer, it makes all that other stuff just work a little bit better. I don't know what it is,
Okay,
It makes it stand out a little bit less, which maybe seems like it would be the opposite, but I don't think it is, because it reinforces the fact that the liturgy, the normative form of the Mass, is sung, right? It's not low Mass with some music added onto it.
Yeah, great
Right.
point.
Yeah, and then especially when you look at like the Eastern rites of the Church or the Eastern Orthodox churches too, there's like no such thing as a said liturgy.
Right. It doesn't exist.
It's like it's all sung. I mean, no, it doesn't. I mean, even when you're at like a graveside burial, and there's just like a couple of prayers being said, and it's not like a full funeral, like they'll still be singing it. Like there is no way of praying liturgically in the Eastern rites of the Church without singing. When we're looking on the ground tangibly, let's say the St Gregory Institute, for instance, Nick, to pivot to that, is there any like what kind of help, I guess, or yeah, like assistance does the St. Gregory Institute or institutes like it offer to parishes?
Sure. Yeah, there are a number of small organizations like ours that have popped up in recent years, and larger ones too. A group like the Church Music Association of America, for instance, which is a very old organization, has received kind of a breath of new life in the last 20, 25 years. They focus on making resources available and also holding skills building sessions, gatherings, things like that. So the St. Gregory Institute, primary thrust of that is equipping musicians with the proper skills to be effective Roman Catholic Church musicians. Because even in a lot of Catholic universities, you might be, in a lot of places you can get a degree in sacred music from even a Catholic university and not have any practical experience with Gregorian chant and polyphony in the liturgy. You might study it, you might sing it in a concert choir, but you in a lot of places it's not part of the lived experience. Also, I think this model, of going to, I have 2 degrees in Oregon, which is kind of a weird thing, and historically it's a very weird thing because that being a church musician was always a master apprentice affair, and in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, that moved into academia, and there are advantages to that, but in some ways it's a little unnatural, and now we're starting to see a lot of these organ and church music programs go by the wayside, especially at state schools, who of course want nothing to do with a church music program in most cases. And colleges are so expensive, and so anyway, with the St. Gregory Institute, the idea is we're kind of distilling it down to be able to offer very effective training directly with master musicians at a very affordable price, like a vocational school for church musicians. The other type of person that we strive to serve is people who are kind of pressed into service in the church, and I'm sure we all know people who, God bless them, they had like 5 years of piano lessons, and they're like, oh, you can play the organ, and they do their best, right? But they need a little bit of help, right? And what are they going to do? They're not going to go get a degree in organ, you know what I mean? But they need something more than just like a week-long session. Those are skills, conducting and playing the organ and knowing Gregorian chant, those are skills that are built over years. And so this is sort of designed to be that in-between, between maybe like, a week-long session in the summer and getting a degree somewhere.
Excellent. That's awesome. Have there been any like highlight success stories that you'd wanna share from the Institute?
Yeah, I mean, we're still young, and still growing, but we've had, a couple of students who have taken various classes and lessons, who have gone on to graduate study in organ specifically. One, now he had an undergraduate degree from another institution, but he was just sort of filling in the gaps with us a little bit, and he's getting a master's degree in organ at Indiana University in Bloomington, which is one of the best schools in the country. But I think beyond the success of our students, really what every time our choir sings somewhere, especially in like a Novus Ordo parish or a place that might not typically hear that music, the response is always overwhelmingly positive from the people, right?
Right.
I can tell you too. One of the things that I've enjoyed about Nick's Institute is that we've been able to pair with them for several opportunities too. His Institute choir came to sing the Fares Requiem for us this past year, and it was one of those really, really awesome things where we were able to record it. We were able to get it on the radio. It was a really awesome affair. And so having that partnership with them gives his students some real boots on the ground, experience with like the day-to-day pastoral, parish kind of choir. But it also elevates the boots on the ground parish choir to be able to do some of this more this more difficult and better repertoire. So there's a nice relationship where we're kind of pulling each other towards elevating each other in that regard. So I've really enjoyed our relationship for that reason.
That's great. Well, I mean, apart from just the information itself, right, about sacred music, what is it, and all these things, like the things that we've covered here, there's so many things that make this such a complicated issue on the ground, like, is your pastor friendly to it? Do you have the funding to pay somebody to do sacred music at your parish? Do you have enough people to kind of gather a small little choir? I mean, there's so many things, like you said, Nick. There's so much inertia that you have to try to fight against. But I think at the very least, the beginning has to start here, where we're having conversations like this on a broad scale. It has to start in the seminaries, like the work that Nick is doing. It has to start in the parish, like what John is up to. So I think pulling everything together as best as we can, especially in our generation, to keep this moving, to keep moving the other way. We have to be just as dogged about preserving our heritage and our tradition, just as much as, say, the progressives were at destroying it and unraveling it for the past 60 or so years. Sorry, that's my opinion. That's just me. But we have to be we really do have to be just as passionate in reviving it and restoring it. So I thank you guys so much for taking the time tonight to be on the show. We'll definitely want to have you guys again if you'd be open to it. So thanks so much
guys.
for your time.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
And I'm sorry that Bach couldn't get a word in.
He's observing.
It was just such a great conversation.
He sees what's going on.
All right, guys. Well, thank you again, and
Take
until
care.
next time.
See you guys.